Welcome to A Date with Darkness podcast, where I will be discussing the impact of hurtful and abusive relationships and how to overcome them so that you can move through your pain and get to the kind of healthy relationships you want, need, and deserve. I'm Dr. Natalie Jones. I'm a licensed psychotherapist based in California. While I hope that you find this podcast educational and informational, please note it should not be substituted for treatment with a licensed mental health professional. Also, due to the nature of the podcast, some of the information presented on the show can be sensitive to some of my listeners, so please note that listener discretion is advised. Hello and welcome back to another episode of A Date with Darkness podcast. Can you believe that we're 100 episodes plus now? That's pretty awesome. So the show is growing and I love it. But time goes by so fast. How's your summer going? How's your week been going? I hope that you all have been taking care of yourselves and you're doing something fun this week. And maybe you're doing something fun while you're listening or, after the show and maybe kind of wind down and think about some things, maybe have, a quiet evening, Okay, so of course, how we like to do it. We jump right on in and talk about the administrative stuff first. So of course, if you are looking for the individual and group membership coaching, please be sure to check the link down in the show notes and get on the email list to be the first to be notified when that jumps off. And that should be coming up really soon here. If you like what you hear on this podcast and you find it educational, motivational, or it's changed, how you look at things or just your life for the better, be sure to leave a positive review on your podcast carrier on iTunes. A written review is always great, but it definitely helps people find the podcast. And of course, if you want to be in the know, when I send out the email newsletter every Friday at 8 California time, head on over to drnataliejones.com. There is a free Facebook group for people who are looking to heal from their abusive relationships, A Date with Darkness. All of that information is down below in the show notes. So, all right. So today's guest, I have another wonderful guest, a guest that I have wanted to have on the show, I think, since I started this podcast. So it's been a real pleasure in so many ways to have this guest on. My guest for today is Susan Anderson. And Susan Anderson is an expert on abandonment recovery in all things about abandonment. And she and I have a very candid conversation about what abandonment is, how it shows up in relationships, what causes it, and what you can do about it. And I loved everything that she had to say. And I'm just so appreciative of her coming on the show. It's fun to do this show, but it always makes me glad that I do this show when I have a guest on that I really respect and I've really admired for a long time. And of course, I really respect all the guests that I have on. But when you've like picked up someone's book or you've watched them speak on TV or on some sort of platform, and you're like, oh, one day, maybe we can get to have a conversation. And this is why this podcast is very special, because today was that day I got to have that conversation with Susan, and I'll let you know it did not disappoint. So check out my talk with Susan and listen to all of the golden nuggets that she dropped when it came to talking about abandonment. Hello and welcome to the show, Susan.
Oh, I'm so happy to be here, Natalie.
I'm happy for you to be here. I'm very excited fangirling out. So for people that don't know who you are, can you tell us a little bit about who you are, what you do, and the passion behind your work?
Yes. Well, I'm Susan Anderson, and I'm the founder of Abandonment Recovery. And what that is it's help for healing the primal wound of abandonment.
Mm,
Not just, the current triggers that we go through, like going through a breakup or
mhm,
finding ourselves alone or having low self-esteem and all the triggers that we have in adult life,
mm,
but the primal wound, the source of it all. So that's what I specialize in, and that's what my books are about and my programs. But I got into it because abandonment happened to me in my adulthood, and that's what opened me up to start exploring what
mhm,
possible help there can be for something that once it's triggered can be so debilitating and
mm.
overwhelming. So that's where I'm coming from.
I appreciate you sort of talking a little bit about that. For people that are listening to you and they're not familiar with what abandonment is, or they may have a different idea in their mind of what abandonment is, can you tell us a little bit about what that is and maybe, why is it so hurtful for people?
Well, abandonment is sort of a catch-all term. It refers to that feeling that life itself has left you on a doorstep. You can
Mm,
feel abandoned just with your friends are too busy to get together with you, or if you're
mm,
going through a breakup and if you feel rejected, that's a big trigger of that feeling, that
mhm,
primal feeling of being left all alone, of being worthless and having deep shame over who you are because you've been rejected by someone. So abandonment refers to that feeling. It's universal. We all have it. A fear of not being worthy of connection, of losing our connection, a fear that it can be very unconscious,
mm,
but very, even though it's unconscious and it might be more in the background, we're not conscious of it, it can be triggered just by any kind of feeling that you've been slighted or failed to be recognized or misunderstood. Little things like that can trigger a feeling of hurt, as if you somehow aren't valuable to the other person.
Does that say something about us when we're experiencing that feeling of abandonment at that time? Is there something deeper that maybe is going on within that perhaps we should look at?
Well, it speaks to, emotions that go all the way back to birth, because we acquired the original fear of abandonment with birth trauma,
Mm,
because we were inside our mother's womb where everything was perfect and balanced, and then we were born thrust out into a cold room with bright lights. So we felt, even though we didn't have words as infants, we felt the contrast between the warm, perfect environment of the womb and the abrupt change of being born. And as we went through infancy, we
mm,
kept having that experience. Somebody would pick us up and make us feel warm and cozy and fed, but then we'd be put back down in a bassinet or a crib, and then we'd feel that contrast again and want to be picked up again. So throughout our childhood, we experience that emotion and of disconnect. And when we get to be adults and we experience a disconnect, a disappointment, a rejection, a slight, it it goes to that deep place that goes all the way back to infancy. It's wordless, but it's an emotion. We can't necessarily name it at the
mm,
time,
mhm,
but it's an emotion. And your question kind of says, does it suggest that maybe the person who feels it has deep issues? And the answer to that is it can, because some people are very sensitive to abandonment, any nuance of being rejected, and other people are not as sensitive. But every human being has a vulnerability there, because every human being was born, and every human being has those emotions deep within. Some people have had more defense mechanisms, or maybe they have other more positive emotions surrounding it so that it doesn't hurt as much. But so there's a big difference in people who are more sensitive to feeling rejected, feeling left behind, feeling unimportant, feeling slighted, feeling abandoned. There are people who are more prone to it than others, but everybody has it to some extent.
Mm. The thought that crossed my mind is, what about a time like now, like during the middle of a pandemic, right? How that may have people feeling a lot more abandoned or, lonely than they normally would. And I'm wondering if maybe you can sort of tell us how to discern the difference between a core wound of abandonment and maybe something like an unpredictable, unforeseen event, like, feeling abandoned due to COVID, if that makes sense.
I hear your question. I'll do the best with that I can. I don't know if any studies have been done. I don't really have anything based on any evidence or anything. It's just sort of my gut reaction. But I do think that the pandemic has stirred up a lot of abandonment feelings within people. And those feelings are isolation and losing connections, and not having the connection leads to feelings of sort of losing initiative. So even as things start opening up, people are reporting to me, at least, and I'm this way too, and friends of mine, that they don't really feel like doing as much as they used to. They're not going places and meeting with people as much. They love human company, but they're not seeking it out as much. They've gotten used to being isolated. So I think it really is related. Our response to the pandemic is related to abandonment, but some people, it relates and goes all the way back to their woundedness, and other people, it's just temporary. Eventually, when the pandemic really is over and we start to go back out into life more, they will possibly not have such a thing triggering them. But there's a positive side too. When you're the only one isolated, let's say all of your friends are getting together and they all have relationships and they all have children and they all have something, but you don't. You're the one home. You're the one who doesn't have anything to do tonight. When you're the only one, or you feel that some of your friends have what you don't have, it's more painful. There's more shame. But during the pandemic, nobody went anywhere. We were all isolated. Mm-hmm. So the positive part of it is it put a lot of people on an equal playing field and actually alleviated some of the abandonment pain that people feel. So it sort of cut both ways.
That's interesting to hear that it actually was alleviating to people, but I can certainly see that because, I recall a lot of couples sort of, even people that sort of were married and lived together or just sort of lived together, there was a division in the home or someone had to go stay somewhere, just sort of that, almost like a breaking apart temporarily.
Yes.
So it makes a lot of sense what you're saying.
Yeah.
When you have someone that has a deeper core wound of abandonment and they don't necessarily have the insight or they don't know that they struggle with that.
No.
Can you talk, like, what sort of signs and symptoms do they show long term, like over the course of their lives as a result of feeling that way?
Well, a lot of people have a core wound of abandonment and really don't think of it that way. They don't, it's not conscious. it's something so much a part of them, they don't even know it's there. It's just the core of who they are. But the symptoms are things like feeling a little more sensitive to rejection than the average person, feeling a low self-esteem, having a low sense of personal entitlement, like as if you don't deserve to have a better life, sort of having performance anxiety, which causes you, it interferes in your ability to succeed in life and achieve goals, because you get anxious, you know, when you go on a job interview or when you audition for, you know, a part in the play, your anxiety holds you back. So the symptoms of having a core abandonment wound have to do with your ability also to form secure primary relationships, especially with you know, someone to love. Yeah. That's a not everyone who has core abandonment has that problem, but you'll find among people who struggle to form those secure bonds with a primary love object, those people tend to have very, you know, deep core abandonment wounds. And let's say the thing that caused your core abandonment wound was something like this. Let's say you grew up in a family and one of your parents was an alcoholic. Very common. Many people have that background, but it means that you grew up with a parent who had more of a relationship with alcohol than he or she did with your other parent or with the children. So you grow up with a vague kind of abandonment scenario where you were being chronically abandoned for your needs because the parent wasn't really able to be 100% there. Or you grew up in a family where one of your parents had a terrible burden, maybe a single parent family, or one of your parents was very ill, or was in grief over the loss of one of your siblings or something like that. Then you're growing up in a family, nobody abandoned you per se, but you're growing up in a family where your parents aren't able to really be there 100% for you all the time. And so even situations like that can lead to an adult where there is low self-esteem and, you know, performance anxiety and insecurity in relationships and a lot of self-sabotaging behaviors like overeating or, you know, overspending or something like that, or where you grow up feeling less important than other people, as if you're somehow a lower caste than other people. And where does that come from? Those are symptoms of having a core abandonment wound. But was I ever abandoned? No, my parents were there. Yes, but they had other issues. So it's very subtle things that can lead to that core wound.
So, you know, it sounds like physical availability, but not, they may have been physically available, but not emotionally available.
Yes, and maybe sometimes emotionally available and then not. So it's the contrast. 1 minute you're connected, but then the next minute you're not. And the contrast, it's that you know what feels good and then it feels extra bad when it's taken away. The inconsistency is painful. You're used to being the apple of everyone's eye, let's say. You know, everyone thinks you're just wonderful and everybody, but then all of a sudden everybody's preoccupied with something else and nobody gives you any attention. It's not a serious family issue, but yet something like that, as simple as that, can make you feel that you must not be good enough today, or it's your fault that you're not getting the attention. You're not special enough. And so all of these disconnects that we go through in life make us doubt our worth. And that's why the feeling of rejection hurts so much, because then we think it's something wrong with us.
Thank you for breaking that down so eloquently. I would love to know your thoughts around, you had mentioned, challenges with love as it relates to abandonment. Can you talk a little bit more about that and what you've seen?
Oh, well, it's a vast subject and so important to
Yes.
millions of people, because people suffer these things in silence and don't realize that they're going through the same thing that millions and millions of other people are going through. All
Mhm.
right, one thing is there's a tendency for people who have had abandonment issues in childhood. When they get into adulthood, there's a pattern where they can be attracted only to the unavailable.
Mm.
When someone is hard to get and doesn't treat them quite right, and they have to work for it, and they have to constantly try harder and dress better and be more successful and try to, they're always trying to get the other person to finally wake up and give them love. That pattern of being attracted to the unavailable is a huge problem out there. And
Mhm.
there are people who will chase the unavailable for years and never give up, just keep trying to pursue someone who just isn't there for them. And then there's another problem, almost the opposite, which is that they can't seem to fall in love. They can't seem to settle down. They keep trying to be in a relationship and they get bored. They start becoming critical of the person. They lose passion. And this happens to men and women. But when it happens to men, because men, need to have attraction in order to perform, then they can't really even perform. The relationship just falls apart. So the problems that are involved in relationships can range from being attracted to the unavailable or losing interest in partners and not being able to love. But the most trouble is in feeling insecure in a relationship.
Mm.
It could be where, because of what happened to you as a child, you might have unrealistic expectations of your partner. And then it means that they're great, but you're expecting them to make you feel better all the time, and they can't. You're expecting them to love you in the way that you need to be loved, but they can only love you the way that they know how to love. So the most common problem that people have with core abandonment issues is that they get into a relationship, but the relationship is bumpy. It's uncomfortable because of feelings of insecurity.
Wow. What I'm hearing is, or how I interpret what you're saying is, there's a challenge around connection.
Very much so, especially primary connection. A lot of people have no problem at all having friendships. They have lots of friends, and yet they have a hard time meeting someone to partner up with, meeting a mate. They can meet a mate, but they have a hard time creating a long-lasting quality relationship with that person. But some people have so much insecurity, and their unrealistic expectations and neediness make it even hard for them to sustain friendships. That's very common.
Mm.
And people who have trouble sustaining friendships feel so much shame. They don't tend to talk about it. They don't want to draw attention to it. But so they don't get to find out that millions and millions of people are struggling with that issue.
I want to go back for a second. You had talked about, the physical abandonment versus, the emotional abandonment. In your experience in working with all the people that you've worked with that have had abandonment challenges, do you feel like one is worse than the other, or specifically, I guess, symptomology from one is worse than the other?
Well, I think that this is there are so many exceptions, but let's say a general rule is that physical abandonment is more difficult. And the reason is because a very common scenario is that your parents get divorced and your father leaves. You continue living with your mother, and your father packs his stuff in the car and drives off. And the child, this is physical abandonment because one of the parents is leaving. The child knows intellectually that the father and mother are having problems that has nothing to do with the child. But emotionally, the child feels, well, if only I were more special. If only I rated my father staying. If only I could have helped him to stay. If only I could have helped my mother be better. Or if only, and a child will feel personally responsible by virtue of not being special or not being enough or not trying hard enough. A child will feel diminished by a parent being absent. And the same is true. Let's say a little girl has a mommy and a daddy, and the mommy dies. She's only 5 years old and the mommy dies. This happens. And this child will lose some self-esteem and will have abandonment issues because the other children have their mommies and she doesn't. So they're more special than she is. They rate having a mommy and she doesn't because her mommy died. And then she also doesn't have the mommy, the parent around saying, hi, honey, come on in, here's a cookie. She doesn't get that positive reinforcement because that person is physically gone. And so even when it's a death and not an abandonment, so to speak, a child feels abandoned because it's anything that causes a child to question her own worth comes as an abandonment kind of feeling. So physical abandonment is very painful.
Yeah.
Some parents, if one of the parents dies early and the children are young, the parent will try to overcompensate. Like anything that child wants, the parent buys them no matter what. The parent goes out of their way to make it up to them. But that never really works. There's always a fear that loving someone can end abruptly because the other person can die. And so when physical abandonment is because the parent chose to leave, didn't die, but said, I'm out of here. That's very, very painful because then there's no question the child feels she wasn't important enough. Or, it happens a lot that even the primary caretaker, which is usually the mother, the primary caretaker will say, oh no, I'm going to go off and drive around or use drugs, or I'm not raising you. I'm leaving you with your aunt or something. The child can still be in a secure household with a parent who's an aunt or a grandparent or something. But the child knows that its own mother didn't feel that child was important enough. And of course, we know it wasn't that wasn't what was going on. The parent was dysfunctional in some way, and something big was going on in the parent that had nothing to do with the child. But the child, it doesn't matter what you say to the child is still going to feel, I wasn't important enough. I wasn't special enough. And I blew it. I'm not a good enough child. My essence isn't powerful enough to hold my mother or my father.
Yeah, there's, I've read some stuff. It sounds like what you're talking about in terms of the physical aspect of abandonment is more of the ideology around rejection. Like my parent was physically alive and well, and they chose to leave. And some of the literature that I've read is that children that are neglected versus those are rejected, children that are neglected have a better outcome in the long run than those who have been rejected. So it falls in line with what you're saying. And
Yes.
it's something about a child that, in the research, it says that a child that's been rejected or has a very profound form of rejection will continue to experience that over and over and over again. And I
Yeah.
don't know if that's more of a self-fulfilling prophecy, like, that's this wound is so deep that I just this is kind of how I move through life now.
Yeah. This is what I've gotten used to. So it's what I recognize. So I keep picking people who will leave me like that because it's familiar and it's unconscious. I don't do it on purpose. It just comes very naturally to me. But the neglected child, it's interesting because a lot of children go through stages of being very neglected. They could be taken care of in a very good way. And then all of a sudden a tragedy can hit the family, and they're, for a while at least, they're neglected. Or they're constantly neglected because the parent is irresponsible or whatever. But what children do is they also develop strengths.
Yes.
They develop strengths that other children don't have.
Yes.
Because they now are compensating for and filling in the blanks of a neglectful parent. And so they will have more competency in areas. They'll be able to handle things other children can't. And there's a word for that, post-traumatic growth. You hear of post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD, but post-traumatic growth, PTG, is the strength that we develop from having our, abandonment situations in childhood. And when you look at someone who's gone through a rough childhood, you're looking usually at someone who has insecurities and low self-esteem and so forth, but they have strengths that other people don't have. They're usually very well-developed, unusual people. I don't know if you notice that in, your dealings with people, but it's striking to me.
Can you talk a little bit more about what you mean by well-developed? And yes, I have noticed.
Yes. So let's say that empathy is a strength. We all know that's a good thing to have. But many people who have had a lot of child neglect and have been through terrible times can actually connect with other people because they can imagine what the other people have experienced because they have experienced so many emotions. So they might be more empathetic. Another strength that I notice is versatility, well-roundedness.
Yes.
That, it's sort of the opposite of being like an orchid raised in a hothouse.
Yes.
They're able to deal, they're able to handle, they're sturdy, they can go camping, on the spur of the moment. That might not be a good example because a lot of people can't do that. But anyway, there's a lot of strength. Some people, I'm thinking of one example of someone who had a lot of abandonment stuff go on. Her mother was sick and constantly going back and forth to a hospital. So she would be neglected and then loved, and then neglected and loved. And she was too little to understand the comings and goings. And this is a fairly common, phenomenon. But this woman has superhuman strength, and many people will develop superhuman strength. She overcomes every obstacle. If she wants to get a reduction in her cable bill, she can get on the phone and she gets her way, just superhuman strength. And I find that this is true, that people struggling with abandonment issues from childhood tend to have a lot of strengths that are very, noteworthy. And you can almost tell that the strengths almost tell me, because I'm looking,
Yes.
that the person developed those strengths the hard way.
Yep. Yeah, I would agree. And I think part of it is because, I wonder if part of it is because they had to become an adult way too fast. Like they learned a huge, hard lesson very fast. Part of it, I do wonder about gender expression too. And what I mean by that is particularly between young boys and young girls, some of the research that I've read around divorce and some of the impact of, a parent leaving children with young girls, they seem to be fine, or it's presumed that they're fine and that there's no issues. And, the research says that they have what's called a sleeper effect, which means that the reaction or the impact of being left or being abandoned catches up with them later on down the road as a young adult, as opposed to it sort of manifesting in young
Well,
children.
I haven't seen the research that I'd love to see that, by the way, but I haven't seen that. But what it coincides with from my experience is that, let's take a girl who's, had this abandonment in her family. She's coping. She's okay. She's now taking on adult responsibilities, and she's doing okay. And where you will begin to see the problem is that when she goes to form a relationship,
Yes.
a partner, a mating, when she goes to meet someone to fall in love with or to go out with or go with, it doesn't have to be like a marriage. Just when she begins to have those intimate relationships, then that's when you begin to see a lot of volatility and lots of breakups and patterns where there's constant breakups, or where she might be pursuing the unavailable, or becoming abusive or being abused. I mean, that's when you begin to see how in the primary relationship, that's when it starts to show up. So as a child, she was too young to be having that. But when she got to be the age of wanting a partner, then you begin to see that the problems set in.
So, in your experience, is an abandonment wound healable?
Yes. I mean, it doesn't, well, it's such an interesting way of wording the question. Yes, the answer is yes, yes, yes. And it is something that we can use, the wound, the energy from the wound, we can use it to create a whole new life, because until we figure out how to work with it, it kind of, drains us. It's a big drain. It's a drag, the insecurity, the low self-esteem, the lack of confidence, the performance anxiety, the broken relationships and all of that. But once we learn how to work with that core abandonment wound energy, then things start to look up, but it's gradual. It takes a lot of work. I mean, it doesn't happen just, okay, everything's fine. It's not like that. It's more a process of saying, okay, I can't let this wound continue to erode my life. I have to turn it around. That's when the person realizes that they need to create a new, loving, accepting relationship with themselves. And so all the energy of wanting a connection, but not quite being able to have a connection, that whole feeling that has caused so many problems throughout life, you take that emotion, that wanting a connection, and you turn that with yourself. So you create a connection with your own inner child. And the good news is it does work. No matter who does it, it works. It is effective. The bad news is it involves a process, writing a dialogue, creating a sense of the inner child versus the adult self, and having those two selves really communicate with each other verbally through a written dialogue. I don't consider writing to be something everyone loves to do. I have found that I give workshops all over, and I get people to write the dialogues because I can make it pretty painless, right? When I do it in a workshop or something. But I would say more than half of the people don't like to write. It feels corny and stupid and hokey and boring. And do I have to do it? Not everybody likes to write, but writing the dialogue, when I sort of force them, by making it enjoyable if I can, writing the dialogue actually does work. But putting the writing issue aside, which is a technique, a method. But what you're doing is you're dividing up the self into your inner child of just pure emotion and your adult self, the part that makes decisions and plans and takes responsibility. And once you have sort of created that idea of these two parts, then you can have one part really love the other. The adult can love and accept and really accept the inner child, all of the inner child's feelings, all of their needs, just accept them and promise the inner child to do everything you can to give them a better life. This is a relationship that some people have. They were born into the right family. Yeah. They were treated with love all the time. And so as an adult, they automatically know how to give themselves love. They automatically know how to be kind to themselves and accept themselves and do positive, wonderful things for themselves. They already know, how to do it, how to get a really good job and make lots of money or whatever it is. They already know how to do all that. But other people who have, a core abandonment wound and feel the pain of it, they can figure out how to do that, but they have to do it more deliberately. They have to consciously say, I have a wounded inner child who's lonely and sad and anxious. And it's my job to take that child and give that child a good life. So it is a healable wound. And there are other exercises too. There are many other things that we can do that promote a lot of healing. But healing is very possible. It's inevitable, but it involves an effort. It involves work.
Absolutely. And one of the challenges when you had talked about the physical abandonment piece, where you have a parent figure that sort of rejects you, but they're still here. They just sort of walk away. I'm curious, is that process of healing much more involved for those folks as opposed to people that are just sort of trying to rectify the emotional aspects of abandonment, if that makes sense?
Well, if I say this, it will sound so fantastic, but if you suffered from physical abandonment and you had a really bad case of it, the inner child is so needy and frantic that it almost makes it easier to start a new relationship with yourself. For instance, I'm thinking of someone. I'm going to create a composite scenario. So it's not really any one person, but let's say his father shot his mother right in front of him. And then the father was put in jail, and then he committed suicide in jail. And the son was sent to foster care, and he was sexually abused by his foster father. And he ran away and he was put in another foster home, and the same thing happened. Okay, there are people who've had physical abandonment and then sexual abuse and all the other forms of abandonment. And now they want help. They want to change their lives. You can imagine they have very messed up lives because they have so much, self-sabotage going on. That person can actually start a new process of taking that inner child who went through all that and feeling so much compassion for that inner child, what it's been through and what it still feels, the fear, the insecurity, the shame. And it can say, oh, I hear you. I feel what you're feeling. Thank you for telling me what you're feeling. I need to understand what you're feeling. I'm here. I will never abandon you. From now on, I'm going to do everything I can to give you a better life, so that it becomes a real relationship. So no matter how bad the childhood was, even with physical abandonment, it can still really create a marvelous new relationship that becomes a real change, a change agent for that person.
Nice. As people are going through their healing journey, and you had mentioned in the beginning about people who have struggles with forming intimate relationships and friendships, how do people learn the art of connection?
Well, the amazing thing is, there are a number of tools that are helpful. The tool of visualization is helpful. There are a number of tools, but when you start to have a relationship with yourself based on empathy and kindness and positive behaviors, doing positive things for yourself, when you start that, you are now you become sort of like a sun sending out rays, and people love to catch your sunlight. So the more you work on it, you don't really have to worry about if you're acting any differently. People start to feel more comfortable, because what happens is, when you have a lot of self-abandonment, you hate yourself, you don't like yourself, you're mad at yourself, and there's a lot of self-abandonment, you start looking to other people for approval. You look to other people to make you feel better. It's too much pressure for other people. Your boss loses respect for you. Your friends feel you're too needy. And then or your friends can feel you're too hostile, because of course they can't live up to what you need. But when you start to take care of yourself, you're not looking to your boss to give you approval. You're not looking to your friends to give you all the love you need, because you're giving it to yourself more. So it takes the edge out of stuff, and you become more acceptable to your friends and to a future lover. It takes the edge off. Now, I make it sound like these things are dramatic, overnight, this will happen. I know that's, I don't want to get false advertising, but from your work that this is a process and it takes time. But even if you don't get results from it overnight, it heads you in the right direction. And if you keep at it, it's inevitable. People will feel more comfortable with you, and they will feel compelled by the love and the light you're giving off. So, and then in your primary intimate relationships, you're able to have more realistic expectations so that you can celebrate what you do have with the other person.
Yeah, so what I hear you saying is it is a lengthy process, but it's more about a mindset shift also, where you're shifting your mind from a place of lacking to a place of abundance, almost.
I would say that is the most accurate possible statement. The abundance is coming from your own relationship with yourself. So you're creating that. And it's a precious, sacred relationship with yourself, that you love the inner child. You love that little person inside who's so helpless and feels so weak. And you love that little person. You have so much empathy. That is abundance. Creating that love is abundance.
Absolutely. And I love that. For people, is there anyone that you've seen that hasn't had success in creating that or overcoming their abandonment?
I have seen people feel so overwhelmed by their issues that, and they have so much self-sabotage going on that they don't do the exercises. They say they'll do them and then they don't do them. And so I would say that that is probably the most the most discouraging pattern is, and it's very common. You know, we're all guilty of knowing something's good for us, but not doing it yet. And so people, when they know that this would help them, or at least they see it helping other people, but they just are too lazy, or they're too down and out. They just can't get with a program. They can't do it. I would say those people don't see the results until they really start doing the program. But if anybody doing the program will see results.
Yeah, it almost kind of reminds me of, learned helplessness. Like when you have everything in front of you, but you just give up. So, you give it up
Yes.
so much that you can't even take the opportunities.
Yes. I have learned helplessness when it comes to technical things. So a little something will happen on my email or something. It'll say, somebody's breaking in there. I don't know. And here's a code. And I just immediately, like springs pop out of my head and I start cracking down the middle. I just have learned helplessness. And I can't solve the problem because I go brain dead.
Yeah.
I just feel overwhelmed by it. And that is true for the people who are so overwhelmed by their abandonment issues and they have so much self-sabotage, they're afraid to get started. It isn't that they refuse, it's that they just have the learned helplessness and it's just too much for them. But eventually, if they, that's why I'd give workshops and do talks, because to help people realize, you can always start. If you've struggled with it so far, don't worry about it. You can always start. Perfectionism is an enemy of the person, because perfectionism tells you that you should be able to start the program and you should be able to do it and figure it out and it should work and you should do it every day. And never mind that. We are human beings. We are filled with other issues. We have all kinds of things. Mm-hmm. Perfectionism is never a good thing. We do the best we can. So the idea that anyone can do the program perfectly or anyone can do anything in life perfectly just defeats them, because they can't do it perfectly. They're human beings. We're full of flaws and weaknesses of all kinds. That's what makes us human and beautiful to each other. So, even if some people really have a hard time getting started, they could still start and it still works.
Okay.
But it's not perfect.
I would agree. And it's not meant to be, right?
Yeah.
The beginning wasn't perfect. Yeah. So this has been wonderful learning from you and hearing all of your advice and feedback and just a wealth of information. If people love what they hear, and I know that they will, can you tell us how to reach you, and if you've got any sort of upcoming projects or things going on that we can support you with?
Well, lately I've been giving Zoom workshops. There are 5 sessions and they actually work. I didn't expect them to really work because, you need to be up close and personal, but they've been working. They form really great bonds with all these people. It's amazing. But anyway, on my website at abandonment.net, I haven't posted dates for the next Zoom workshop that I'm giving, but I'll be posting them soon. And then I also have a 6-day workshop coming up in Massachusetts, in Kripalu Institute. And it's a chance to spend 6 days with me having workshops, lots and lots of workshops with me, and getting very close to the group that you meet. Let's say there are 35 or 40 people in the group. A really nice fellowship forms, and we meet and meet and meet for 6 days. So it's really, really nice. And that's coming up, I think, in the fall. But it's on my website, abandonment.net. And of course, I have books, and I have abandonment books, and I have abandonment blogs and tapes and many things.
I love it. And you have 3 books now. Is that right? Or how many books?
Actually, 4. I have Journey from Abandonment to Healing. And then I have the Abandonment Recovery Workbook. I have Taming Your Outer Child, which is all about the self-sabotage and how to overcome that. And then Black Swan, the 12 Lessons of Abandonment Recovery, which is a very short little fable.
Yeah, I love that one. I love them all.
Good.
But yeah, I forgot about the Taming the Outer Child, but you're right, I do have that one. So yeah, I love that one. So there's huge lessons to learn in all of those. So I would definitely encourage people to go out and pick that up. And you have such wonderful work, and we appreciate you. And I really enjoyed having you on. I learned so much.
I enjoyed every minute, Natalie. Thank you so much.
You're quite welcome. Okay, so let me know what you thought about what Susan Anderson had to say. If you follow me on social media, be sure to comment below the post. If you're on YouTube watching this, let me know your thoughts down in the comments below. Love to connect with you, see how this episode in particular resonated with you. Just a really quick story time. I've always been I was very candid and open about why I started the show way back in the earlier episodes, but a lot of I had read the majority of Susan's books because abandonment was also something that I had struggled with, the feelings of rejection and everything like that. So it's so interesting to be on the other side of that and just know with everything that she's talking about, but I think not just from an academic, like I've studied it, or I've worked with people who struggle with it, but just to kind of be on the other side of someone who's kind of struggled with that and I've worked really hard to overcome that. So it's just been very interesting to be on the other side of that, because everything that she had to say, I agreed with. It was very spot on. And again, I'm so very appreciative that she came on the show. So I hope that you guys take care of yourselves. And I look forward to chatting with you again on next week's episode. Be sure to stick around and tune in, because that's going to give you a snippet of next week's episode, so that you can see what you have to look forward to. You guys take care. Talk next time. Check out the sneak preview of next week's episode.
So I had a fear of abandonment. I've had that. I remember, like, I was 17 and I was seeing someone, and I remember saying to my friend, like, it's like I'm afraid he's gonna leave me. I'm afraid people are gonna leave me. I didn't think much of it at the time. I didn't even look into whether it was a real thing. But I've always had that fear of abandonment. I've always sort of chased after emotionally unavailable man. Always done it. As soon as you tell me you don't want a relationship, I'm gonna change your mind. I'm gonna show you are wrong. And when I can't convince you to change your mind, I'm gonna wonder what's wrong with me. You know what I mean? Why couldn't I be the one to make you want a relationship? And then when I would meet men who were available and seemed interested in me, and who could give me the things I was looking for, that sends me into a panic as well.